Oh yeah, really?
Are we on?
That wasn't clear.
Hi.
I don't know. Does that mean we're on? Oh, cool. Hello and welcome to New Polity. Welcome to our podcast, The Politics of Tyranny. And this is our last episode. And I'm excited because I'm beginning to feel like it's spiraling out of control.
Yeah, me too, man.
You can only talk about one thing for so long.
I feel tyrannized by the tyrant. Oh no.
I
By
start
the
to feel,
concept of tyranny.
I don't know if other people feel this way. I start to feel dense.
Yeah.
There's you have this insight and you think, well, this insight can kind of carry over into other topics. Then you find out, no, it carried over into 3 topics. And that was nice, but it's not an indefinite thing to make a career out of. So we offer you our limited analysis of tyranny, how it works and what to do about it. And we want to sum it up today with one more mechanism of tyranny. So we've talked about a lot of the ways that tyrants both amass power for private gain and hide it from others. We want to talk about a mechanism by which they do this, which I think is a little paradoxical because in some ways it encompasses all of the other mechanisms, making it fitting for a final episode. And this mechanism is war.
War.
So war, we're going to argue, is not something that a tyrant might do. It's something that a tyrant must do in some way. And it's something that gives a certain amount of explanation to the various other technologies of tyranny that we've been discussing. So with your leave, Andrew, instead of starting with the philosophical questions, what is war? What is peace?
Right.
What is the city of God, city of man?
All right.
I want to get there, but maybe to clarify this first, let's start with our own age, our own tyranny. Let's look at liberal modernity, such as it is, and ask the question of how does war operate within our society in order to benefit tyrants? Again, tyranny is rule for private gain. So whenever we're talking about a mechanism of tyranny, we're talking about something, some ordering of society, some injection of fear into a society that makes that private gain possible. You got to do it. You have to order society in some way, because if you don't, if it's just a naked attempt to rule for private gain, then you will be killed. Your tyranny will be ineffective, as we've discussed.
So maybe the heart of it would be that war rests upon the existence of an enemy.
Yeah, totally.
Right. And the enemy, and one of the things that characterizes the enemy is that his good and your good are not compatible, I think. Right. So like it has to be framed in a zero-sum sort of game.
Absolutely.
Okay. So the enemy wins, that means you lose. That seems to be the heart of war.
Yes.
So when faced with an enemy, then you need to win.
Yeah. Your options are win or die,
right? Or become enslaved or something,
Sure.
but lose, right? There's no like mutually beneficial outcome. Now, I think in a liberal society, the war, there's actually 2 or more sort of fronts, right? So I think at a philosophical level, you have the beginning point of liberalism, which is that men are at war with each other as individuals.
Yeah, right.
Right. So we begin in a state of war, and that's the sort of natural form of human interaction at the individual level.
Yeah.
And so the state then, or the tyrant, we can say, can position himself as the one who manages the war. All right. So this is a sort of indirect use of war, I think, for the tyrant. And it's maybe the genius of liberalism that they can do this, because really my perception is that I'm at war with you. And then the state is the one who's going to keep you from winning.
Right. Yeah,
okay. or and that's a good deal for me. Okay. So there's that aspect of it, I think, within liberalism. But then I think there's also within liberalism, we've talked about being at war with inadequacy, any sort of like limitation, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So we're at war with scarcity. We're at war with unhappiness.
Yeah.
When
we talked in the very beginning in the garden, you had the presumption of scarcity being the kind of, maybe it's the first sin, maybe it's the precondition for the first sin. I'll let the theologians parse that one out.
Yeah, right.
But this idea that human nature lacks.
Mhm.
You only envy divinity insofar as you're cursing humanity.
Right.
And that's precisely what Eve and then Adam do that day under the tree. And what we've spoken of throughout these episodes is that what a fundamental curse against humanity does is it makes people always available to manipulation and to motivation,
Mhm.
right? If there is always something lacking, then there's always some thing that can be offered in order to fulfill that lack, right? And this goes, and to say this is the attitude of war is very literal. I mean, you said war is a zero-sum game. Well, what that means is that insofar as the enemy is always there, then it's always an immediate danger.
Mhm.
And there's always the availability to motivate or manipulate within the context of war.
That's
I
right.
mean, this
yes.
is, and I'm not saying anything like incredibly difficult. If you go into someone's peaceful home and say, hey, everyone run out the front door, they won't. But if you go into someone's home and you say, hey, the house is
It's on
burning
fire.
down,
Yeah.
everyone run out the
They
front
will.
door, they will.
Right.
When life is threatened, when that sort of either I win or I lose really is the mentality of an individual, however you can affect that, then you can make that individual do things. And what
Mhm.
is fundamental to tyranny is that you have to provide motivations that aren't natural to the person, because
Right.
the person naturally works for the good, for the common good, right?
Mhm.
And you have to, and for his individual good within that common good, but certainly not for the good of others at his own expense. That's
Right.
just
So
an unnatural thing.
the lie is that we're at war when we may or may not actually be at war.
Yeah. The
And
lie is that the house is on fire. Now,
Right.
the point is not that there are not real wars within this. And I know we want to talk a little more about where the tyrant is using something true about humans, that they are at war.
Mhm.
But the point is that in a real material sense, tyranny must deny the attainment of peace, because wherever peace is attained, that ability to motivate beyond the nature of man, or say below or outside the nature of man, goes away.
Mhm.
Tyrant loses that much more of his capacity. The more that there's people that say, well, I won't do what you say here because everything's all right.
Right. No, that's right. And the war and that lie then facilitates or makes possible, I guess, the ordering of society on a military footing or on a war footing. And this is so like sometimes maybe it's hard for people to see this, but if we look at it where it's just obvious, like the army itself,
Yeah.
right? Like, why is the army ordered the way it is? But more, I guess more importantly for me would be, why does the individual soldier submit to the army? Like, why does he become a soldier in the army and agree to its regime?
Yeah.
Right. And it's because he perceives that army to be necessary because of war, right? Whether, war or potential war, with to defend things that he loves other than the army. Okay.
Totally.
So my point would be, like, you think about a soldier's life and that he has a far reduced set of rights than the non-soldier. His life is regimented.
Yeah.
He's
be in certain places at
be at
certain
certain times. You have to live some. You don't have self-determination. You have to follow orders.
I was an army brat.
Yeah. My brother is
And
a career army.
There's the phrase, which it's kind of a cliche, but home is where the army sends you.
Yeah,
It was
exactly. Yeah.
on a lot of walls.
Yeah.
nowadays.
And so you think about a soldier's life and the way he's not a normal citizen, but is really, his freedom is restricted, and he's a soldier. Okay, so the point would be that looking at that paradigm allows us to then see, okay, the militarization or the to put society as a whole on a war footing is an opportunity of extending that sort of thing further into society as a whole. Right. And for the same reason that the individual soldier will join the army, society as a whole will accept a army-like ordering because it's at war.
Yeah. And
right?
I think that this might come across as purely anti-military or something.
Oh, no.
But rather what I think is being said is that actual war is in fact the only justification for tyrannical forms.
Yes. I mean, what I'm saying, that is exactly what, like, war necessitates war, which is something that is a perversion of the cosmos, right? Like, it is because of sin.
Hmm.
It necessitates forms that are themselves tainted by sin, that are themselves. So like Augustine will talk about, some form of servility
Yeah.
as being appropriate because of sin, because of the reality of sin. So
Sure.
so now some men will dominate other men, but that's because of the imperfection of society. But because it's in an imperfect state, that a certain degree of dominance and servility is a part of the perfection that's possible to it.
Right.
Right. Okay. So
No, I mean, you think about the fact that within the army, insofar as it is facing real war, its structure becomes justified, right? You
Right.
have like, well, you need to obey unquestioningly and without participation in the reason of those who are above you,
Mhm.
because of it's expedient, right?
And because you're not actually living in peace,
Right.
and so you are faced with an enemy. So like the idea that peace emerges out of, say, dialogue and conversation, and like a culture emerges out of that peacefully. When there's an extrinsic enemy,
Yeah.
right? That's not happening.
Yeah.
Right. That enemy is not a part of that dialogue.
Right.
Right. And so you can't, if you retain the perfectly peaceful form, you'll be conquered.
Right. Absolutely.
I mean, you have to counter the enemy,
Right.
and to counter him is not like a sin,
Right.
right? Because and I think we can, maybe a way of thinking about this is to bring it down to a very small level. Like you brought up, lying about the house being on fire, and you can see a similar sort of thing, I think, maybe in the imperative to self-defense.
Sure.
So we started out in the very beginning of this podcast talking about the two forms of power, I think, and St. Thomas talking about how there's the power of the sort of power that a father has over his son, which is the power of love, which is a power that is deployed for the good of the one over whom it's wielded.
Mm.
Right. But then the other form of power is the power of the master and the slave, which is wielded for the good of the powerful one and not for the one over whom it's wielded.
Mm-hmm.
And we in all of this conversation that we've been having, we're sort of expounding that servile form of power, master, slave form of power. But the thing is, that itself can be just that form of power. So let me put it this way. So if your house is being invaded, if there's a burglar who's breaking into the house, who's armed and is threatening your family, right? He's intruding into this house and violating the peace. He's at war with you. That your use of force, your use of power against him to stop him from doing that is not for his good. Right. It's you're not wielding that power for his good. Now, you always have to be open to it. So like, were he to surrender, were he to stop, at that point, then you can say, okay, now there's an opening for peace here, which means there's an opening for me to wield my power for your good, to include your good in my power wielding. But for as long as he's attacking, that's not the case. Sure. And so I am deploying my power over him for my good, not his.
Well, though I think the difference, so we say that there's that the condition of war, which you're kind of zooming in on here, justifies tyrannical forms, but it's important to point out that it's never identical to actual tyranny, because what's different in this situation is that while you are not wielding your power for his good, and you cannot wield your power for his good,
right?
Nevertheless, you're also not wielding it for private gain.
That's right. So it's half. It's half the form. Right.
Half the form of tyranny is just war.
yeah. And the thing would be is that, in a sense, like, from the perspective of the invader, you're wielding the tyrannical form.
Yes, absolutely.
Because he doesn't know your ends, nor does he care.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
But it's not for private gain, right? So it's not actually tyranny. And that is the decisive difference, because that's the difference that opens it up to peace, right?
Absolutely. I don't mean to get us off track here, but in yours, you've enlightened me with a lot of your research, and a lot of it's in your book, Two Cities, on the kind of moral reform of the knights and of then going into the Crusades. That it seems to me like this was precisely what the church dealt with, that there is a warring that can be holy insofar as it's fundamentally open to surrender, and it gets and the preaching against any kind of rage and war, any kind
Vengeance.
of vengeance, any
Yeah.
kind of delight in
Right.
blood,
Right.
that sort of thing,
Yeah.
becomes the Christian war ethic,
Mhm.
because it's essentially looking at that, like how do you war in such a way that you can always say, I'm not doing it for private gain, which could include something like pleasure, vengeance,
Right.
and say, but I'm gonna stab this guy because he's an invader that wants to kill my children.
Yeah. Right.
Like, both of those have to be held.
Yeah.
And that seems to be what the church's response historically gave us the image of the Crusader, or the just knight.
That's right. Yeah.
And now
Yeah.
we're a little lost on that, I think, sometimes. But
Yeah, but once we have that principle in play, we can see then how what appear to be tyrannical forms can have a place within a just society, because
Sure.
a just society, in which power is not being wielded for private gain,
Yeah.
it's still being wielded against sin,
Yes.
right? And when it does that, so it's being wielded against tyrants,
Yes.
little tyrants, big tyrants, whatever. I mean,
Yeah.
it can be criminals. It can be the tyranny inside your own soul, the places where you're vicious, right? But it's being wielded against imperfection, vice, sin. And when it does that, it takes on that sort of half tyrannical form that we're talking about.
Yeah.
So you have there's a place for propaganda. There's a place for bureaucracy. There's a place for even punishment, cruelty. We called it cruelty. There's not a place for cruelty in a formal sense, but
excessive punishment.
but something that appears that way,
Right.
or is felt that way,
Yeah.
right? There's a place for the enforcement of norms that are sort of extrinsic, right? These things can all be versions of me fighting the intruder and coming into my home,
Totally.
right?
And it seems what's fundamentally different, is that within tyranny versus what we might just call just war, or that comes loaded with a lot of ethical questions. So maybe the better thing is just to say that half tyranny of defense,
Right.
seems to be that the church, good men fighting as they should, is always dynamically open to that end of the war.
That's right.
So
That's what it seeks.
Right, it seeks peace.
It seeks peace.
Whereas within a tyranny,
But it seeks peace not of its own making.
what do you mean?
What I mean is it seeks the peace of order, of the cosmic order.
Yeah.
Right? So
I see.
a just warrior, when the other surrenders, he welcomes him into the order of the brotherhood that men live in under the divine rule of the cosmos. He doesn't have to enter them into a peace that he creates through his dominance.
Sure.
Right? So it's not, your surrender is not, now you're my slave.
Right, and this is what maybe you mean by the presumption of peace, that like once war is done, there is a real peace to return to. It's not just that war needs to establish and continue.
That's right, and that's the
something called
difference,
peace.
because if you look at like St. Augustine, he'll talk at great length about how even the most tyrannical people are seeking peace. But because peace, the pursuit of peace is a human constant, he thinks. And I think he's right. But where they're different, where the tyrant is different from the just man, is that the tyrant thinks that peace is only to be had under his dominance.
Yeah.
He's the source of peace.
Yeah.
Right? And what he means by peace is I get whatever I want. Right? But that and because of that, he's perverted, right? He's and really the way Augustine talks about him is that he's aping God.
Well, yeah, I mean, you can see how if it's not how if you are going to be like God, you would have to be able to provide the peace and the sort of, how do I say it? That you would never be satisfied with just some limited number of people being under you. That there would always be the desire to ape God in the sense of a universal kingdom. Universal
you need
peace.
all of it. Right, which is the reason why you never find peace.
Yeah.
Right, you never actually achieve it. But I mean, that's one of the reasons that not only externally there are enemies, but there's always enemies internally, because human beings in their natures are in communion with God and the cosmos, not with your fictitious world that you've built. So you can never exhaust it.
Well, let's narrow in on this man-made world, because I think people have a sense of this, that if you want to order society unto your private gain, then the continuation of a war, and I would argue it has to be a sort of material war, because you're building a material world. You're trying to make a man-made world in which you are at the top of a hierarchy here. That this can be really easily seen in the extension of things that are just in accordance with actual threats, with actual war, with actual disaster, into the common life of society. So they're never allowed to dissipate. Peace is never allowed to really arrive.
Right.
So you see this in like
Peace is always sort of deferred. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, there's ways in which you can just see this in recent history. So what do I mean? Well, if you look at something like, I don't know, something simple like wartime production. So it's a common story that I think we've all been told, that what really kicked off the era of mass production and the sort of American dominated era of consumption and production were the wars, which the people, there was no real distinction between, soldier and someone now going to work in a factory in order to produce everything that the soldiers needed in order to win the war. There was a sort of everyone's involved.
Yeah. Total mobilization.
Exactly. And what we found is that is a form of life. You can live, you can create jobs, you can create families, you can create an order that comes from the production of war goods, things that are necessary to defeat the enemy. And you can already see within the war propaganda how, like, well, it's necessary to, and I'm not saying any of it's not true. I think it is true in reference to the real war. Say, okay, you got to save money for the sake of the troops. You've got to plant gardens in this way for the sake of the troops. You have to get all of the women.
I would say the women into the factories.
Into the factories for the sake of the troops. Now, it's obvious, just historically, is that we didn't stop doing the things that we started doing. So women in the factories is obvious. So it wasn't like, okay,
war's over.
We won the war.
Now I can go back home with the kids.
Absolutely not. It was a deliberate propaganda extension of a new image of what normal looked like. Peace looked like mass production. Sure, we're not necessarily mass producing. Well, we still are actually producing the bullets and bombs. I mean, this is still. I hesitate because sometimes when people talk this way, they get into that whole like industrial military complex meme, I guess.
Yeah.
But the argument's true, just because
it is true.
Yeah, like that our economies depend on weaponry production.
Yeah,
it forms such a significant part of our GDP that you can't deny it as like, well, this is just something we could stop doing.
I know, and you always hesitate because you start feeling like you're going down some sort of conspiracy theory road.
Yeah.
Because you're like, and then what's necessary is that we every once in a while destroy it all.
Yeah.
And it's like, and you feel like, well, necessary was someone making that decision, and people thinking that, but then things like our leaving Afghanistan happened.
Right.
And we're like, wait, hold on.
Yeah.
We really did just sort of destroy 20 years worth of military equipment.
Gotta build it
or
up.
just left it there, so that we got to do it. Yeah. But so it's like it may not have to be some sort of a
single
scheme.
actor
It's so much as just like it's the dynamic of the structure.
Well, and maybe this will help us get away from such conspiracies and such.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, is to say that what we really learned in the war experience, and what probably everyone learns in a war experience, is that the production itself can benefit tyrants. So what I mean is, it doesn't have to be bullets. It could be Beanie Babies. It doesn't have to be.
Yes, that's exactly. I was going to say that it doesn't have to be that we're building tanks and then blowing them up.
Yeah.
It can be that we're building TVs and then throwing them away in a year.
Right.
And then getting more TVs.
Yeah, exactly. Like what is war like? Like let's just think again of what we're saying. We're saying that the tyrant utilizes war by making it a permanent feature of society, as opposed to something that has a real possibility of ending. Right. And then when it does end, a real change in society, which goes from we are at war to we are at peace.
Right.
And maybe the fundamental sign of this is the existence of the standing army, because if you compare what's different about our nations to Christendom, really, is that for us, we always have an army. There's no like mustering of troops. There's no okay, respond to a particular need by getting the guys.
Mhm.
It's professional and it's constant. So the presumption of war, while not guaranteed by, like I can see an argument, well, you have a standing army because you're just training and keeping soldiers,
Yeah.
but by and large, the existence of a massive standing army, and it is massive, is evidence that the presumption of war is continued, right?
Oh yeah, I think that's right. Yeah.
So, but in our then economic life,
Mhm.
we take on warlike characteristics as a people. So you think about what happens when we undergo a recession, right? We're all told to buy things. What? Well, it doesn't matter.
Right.
Like the actual process of producing, buying, and selling must go on, or else we die. Economy collapses,
Mhm.
right? So it's the creation of a kind of economy that needs to operate at scale that benefits the tyrants, and then can't be stopped, which is like that kind of language of it cannot be otherwise. We must do
Right.
it this way. That's war language.
Yes, I think
That's
that's
that
right. Yeah.
zero sum game, win or lose. And I would argue that the kind of um, extension of the language of competition as being what's most fundamental to production, to making things,
Mhm.
is just the extension of the state of war into the very bottom level of like entrepreneurship.
I
and
think
up.
so. Yeah.
Like
That's right.
to spend money, to sell things, to produce things is described as a competition in which someone else's success is your loss, and that this happens on an individual level within like the way we teach people in business schools, and then it happens all the way up to a national level. Like us not selling means that China's going to win.
Right.
Now, is this true? Yeah, right now it's true.
Well, it can become true. It's war. It can become true because non-Christian orders war with each other.
yeah, yeah,
Right, and that it really is the case that they're at war with each other.
yeah.
Right, but it is important to see that what you're talking about here, the connection between the army, and I think a standing army is a really good thing to call out, just historically speaking, because historians are always hesitate to make causal arguments because you can't always tell which direction things are going, but you can definitely make arguments that these things are happening together at the same time, and so they're fundamentally related. That it's obviously the case that the creation of standing armies and the creation of administrative states, bureaucratic states, tax collecting states, states that are capable of regulating the economy because they're states that have now tens of thousands of officials, states that manage whole territories in order to facilitate the standing army, in order to pay the salaries to the standing army, in order to have enough money to train them, right? That these are totally connected,
Yeah.
right? Intimately connected. And even the emergence of propaganda, like just obviously the case.
Yeah, tell me about that.
Well, I mean, if you want to see modern propaganda, the emergence of it, well, you can always push things back further. But if you look at something like the French Revolution, you'll start to see where we have the first citizen army of a sort, like massive army, right? Massive army and total mobilization of the society to support that army.
Yes.
Since the Roman Empire, I mean, the idea of like a citizen army is something that the pagans had. It ceases to exist during Christendom.
I feel like I've heard the story before.
It ceases to exist and then reemerges in modernity,
right?
Of an army of the able-bodied men, basically, and then the whole mechanism behind it to support it. Well, part of motivating that whole operation is the creation of what will develop into modern nationalism, which is, and then the propaganda and secret police apparatus that perpetuates, and the censorship machines that make sure that what's being printed is the right stuff, right? So you're off to as soon as you have the creation of as soon as Europe is sort of reordered according to what's unleashed in the Napoleonic Wars, and so reordered into these centralized national states with large standing armies and mass societies, then you have an essential aspect of that development is the creation of mass media. And so that means the invention of propaganda, and it comes into it, you start a lot of experiments with this in the 19th century, but it really comes into its own leading into World War I, where propaganda as a scientific endeavor is developed in order to motivate not only the soldier but the fighting at the home front, which is in the
Yeah.
factories, the production, the
Yeah.
fight for production, right, as well as the soldiers. That then the science of propaganda literally becomes the basis for the development of marketing after the war. I mean, like literally, like the same people, right? Like literally, we learned how to do this. We can apply this to selling stuff, right? And so
Yeah.
and then this even becomes even more perfected in World War II, where the same people again go to work in propaganda, and then come out of the war and found the huge ad agencies in New York City, right? Like this is
people.
the same people, the same guys. Yeah,
Yeah.
like it's the same people. It's not like, oh, aren't these related?
Yeah.
It's like, no, it's actually the same people
so-
doing the same thing with the same mechanisms, the same techniques, the same rules that they've learned.
Right.
And so
And then the transformation of our society into one which is fundamentally and constantly open to mass information,
right.
whether by billboard or radio or, moving on until now where we are accessible by our pockets.
But I think it's really an essential aspect is the idea that you learn what's going on by being told it,
Yeah,
not by seeing it,
totally.
right?
Yeah,
Like,
when this was part of our discussion about propaganda,
Right.
that's what's sort of fundamental and unifying to all its various
yeah, as you're being told it from out
forms.
without, and that always has, I think, a war footing to it, right?
Well, wouldn't you
Because
say
it's-
that it's obviously justified in the case of actual war?
Yeah, then it is
It's
because
like if we're in a war and you tell me like go into the other room and get munitions, if I'm like, well, let me see for
yeah, or
myself
if you
there's a
say,
need.
or if you say, hey, I know you live in like whatever Alabama, but let me tell you something, Wyoming is under attack,
Yeah, sure.
right? It's like I don't see that. I'm 2,000 miles away,
But I move because
but
it's real.
I need to react to
Yeah,
that,
yeah,
right? We need to react to that. So I'm being told what's going on.
Mhm.
I'm being informed. I'm
Yeah.
being, what we need to do
Yeah.
as a people. So that form of communication becomes necessary in war.
So you can see already how the forms that we've spoken of, propaganda, bureaucracy, and
The ability to organize and transmit orders,
yes,
strategy, univocally,
Yeah.
like across populations in order to counter an enemy,
yeah,
which is sort of the mechanism of bureaucracy,
yeah,
is necessary. Yeah.
right, and then moving this outside of wartime and into peacetime has obviously been the trajectory of our society,
Right.
and we would argue the trajectory of any good tyranny.
Yeah.
Well, now the problem then, and I would point to two other things because it's worth doing. One is that the transformation into a warring state also always involves a destruction of diversification, of diversity.
Yeah.
Um,
Right.
which is I think we've discussed this as one of the paradoxes of liberalism, that it promises a sort of multiculturalism, everyone's pursuing a diversity of ends. We're becoming like a very differentiated people because there's no one church telling us what to do or something like that.
Yeah.
But then the actual result is
So the homogeneity.
we're just we're places
the
and
most
people
extreme homogeneity conceivable.
right, look very similar. Yeah.
Yeah.
and so we've been discussing this as sort of a failure maybe of the liberal project, but it seems from this perspective, it's also, you can see how it belongs to the transition from a presumption of peace to a presumption of war.
Mhm.
That kind of giving of information, of giving of will, order, all the way down to society, requires the actual creation of similarity in the people. So what I'm saying is, it's not like accidental that soldiers wear uniforms. Like, we are trying in a good army that works effectively against a real war to create people that are very similar. Like, we're trying to get rid of all the differences so that orders can be received univocally. We don't want diversification of culture.
It's
we don't want
very-
diversification of language,
it's-
and this is the actual formation of when you talked about Napoleonic France,
Right.
But really, just every single nation state of modernity became what it was in and through the destruction of local difference.
Absolutely right.
And I think it's not just that they're like mean and don't
They knew what they were doing.
yeah, they're at war.
Yeah, they're at war, right? That's right. I mean, it's funny, or it's interesting that we bring up the Middle Ages as the sort of foil, right? To say it was different in the Middle Ages, and that's just true. That if you look at the armies that were assembled, like the crusading armies, the huge armies, but you can look at the smaller armies and the same principle as it played. They're exactly not uniform,
Oh,
right?
really?
So like, not only do you have forces coming from the different kingdoms, but underneath the kings, the forces that are raised are under the lords, and under the lords they're under the knights, and they at each level they have their own coat of arms, their own colors,
heraldry.
their own and they're organized in these totally diverse units. So if you to see a medieval army on the march would have just been a phenomenal just hodgepodge, like a mosaic of different colors and different uniforms and different forms of armor and different loyalties. It was exactly not uniform.
Well, what it was exactly, or maybe
not a standing army.
Well, not a standing army, and because not a standing army, it was Israelite. What I mean,
yeah, it's like the way,
yeah. So like we described this, man, I'm forgetting what we've talked about, but it seems to me like we've described the Israelite army and the way that they never homogenized in order to go to war. It was a muster, and it was always a muster of the particular families.
Right.
And even, I mean, you read the scriptures, that became, even the differences became problematic when they wanted to go to war like the God Kings would. So there's language barriers and stuff like it's discussed in the Old Testament.
Right.
Okay, but so you can see then what we take to be as, I think typically, maybe I'm wrong on this, it seems to me typically when people look at liberal modernity and they try to explain the differences, almost everything they explain could be described as a part of the total militarization of society. And that we don't need to flesh, or we don't need to give flesh to the whole argument here, but it seems that the maybe seed or the beginning of this is in liberalism's positing of war as a fundamental condition of man.
Right, which is another way of saying that scarcity is constant.
Yeah, that situation in which you can be told what to do and you must do it because it's a zero-sum game between you and an enemy.
Yeah, that's right.
Always applies.
Always applies.
And it seems like, and you can see then, it's not to say it has no dynamism. Like, obviously we can become less convinced of an enemy really being the enemy. And so one obvious features of Western society, or really maybe just modern societies, is a constant sort of cycling through and reshuffling to find effective enemies with which to make that vision of war true, and for it to really, I mean, René Girard writes a lot about this, and it, I say he writes a lot about this. This is actually all he wrote about.
I mean, it seems ridiculous in a lot of ways because it seems so sort of cliched as that you hesitate to bring it up, right? That the idea that you need an enemy. But if you look at history, just recent history, I mean, just look at, like, we go from World War II, where we built this monstrosity, this regime, straight into the Cold War. As soon as the Cold War ends in 1991, we're all like twiddling our thumbs and not quite sure what to do until, thank goodness, 9/11 happens, right? And now we have the war on terror. That starts to peter out, right? And it's like, oh, we don't really have enemies. We can't really make China our enemy because we make too much money off that. So you know what, North Korea, that's not going to work. That's not going to work. Okay, we better find internal enemies. And so now we have the whole COVID thing going on.
Yeah, we have the unvaccinated.
And so now we're gonna, now it's.
And there's a double irony there, because within the unvaccinated as the enemy, vaccination, like the ability to effectively medically manage an entire population in a homogenous way, is obviously itself a military effort.
Yeah, obviously.
I don't mean this like philosophically. I mean it historically. Like
the military. This is why there's like a sort of we don't need to go too deep into the details of a lot of this, but like there's a sort of weirdness to the soldiers and stuff right now who are resisting the vaccines or whatever, when like part of being a soldier is they stick a needle in your arm and give you whatever they want. Right. I mean, it's like, you're going to Africa, here you go, boom. And it's like, what was in that? I don't know.
Exactly.
I'm going to Africa, this is the shot they give us, right? And but the point would be that the militarization, like extending that sort of managing of bodies, which is, there's an appropriateness to within the military.
Oh yeah, again, like it
becomes extended into society.
And this is why I say where the critique needs to be careful, because it's not that what's being said is, well, these things are like bad in themselves. What's being said is that they are appropriate and good insofar as you have to operate the half tyrannical form because there's a real
enemy.
Yeah, a real enemy. It's real.
The enemy, the devil, ultimately. And it never goes away in the church militant. We're always fighting the enemy.
Well, I think we should discuss that.
Okay.
Maybe with a slower build-up. It does seem to me that you could describe, when people sort of vaguely think of like modernity getting worse, or like having this kind of decline built into it somehow, or just feeling that it's because every point of greater militarization will always hurt. Like it will always meet this resistance as, and I'm thinking of vaccination, but then I'm thinking of, in some ways vaccination is like an obvious way of extending the military regime into life in just some small area that hasn't really received it. And it has. Like, I mean, the medical management of national populations is a thing.
Yeah, yeah.
But like,
it's just sort of bumping it up a notch.
bumping it up, and
Yeah.
so and over an internal enemy it makes it fairly difficult. And I think I think you can kind of look at society, and this is just, I think, a good Christian attitude. Like, without Christ being the end of a society, then what you get ultimately is war. You get war with other pagan societies who are after not any kind of universal good that can be shared, but are after tyranny.
Right. Yeah.
And
Yep.
so what we need to discuss then is what the Christian, I mean, if this is true, if this is a true analysis, that that war and the false but convincing declaration that the war is always ongoing and that the enemy is always present is in fact a mechanism, and maybe the mechanism of tyrannies, and that for the Christian you can only do this it's only justified in a kind of halfway justified.
All right.
Then what is for the Christian the reality of war, and how does that both differ? But I think what we ultimately want to talk about is how is it the genuine source of tyranny, in the sense of like the good that's corrupted within the tyrannical vision.
Yeah. So I mean, this is a very
well,
subtle.
and maybe
we're getting into a very subtle thing.
But I think it's important to say that I think when people hear this, then the immediate vision they have then is then, well, then the Christian must be the one for whom war has no place. Right, so you jump to this other side, the opposite, pacifism,
which is just
like,
completely untrue.
Yeah,
I mean, Christianity is a form of warfare,
and that's biblical, I would say.
quite. I think, yeah.
Well, Christ came to bring the sword, right?
And also, that's right. And in the tradition as a whole, we understand ourselves to be at war.
Yeah,
that this is the church militant, right? And the war is. I mean, I guess the most sort of general way of describing it would be that what Christianity in time is a movement from our imperfection to our perfection. We've talked about this before when we were talking about inequality, I think. The movement from the imperfect to the perfect. And the imperfect is not merely imperfect in the sense of being undeveloped, but because of sin, it's the disordered, right? The perverted. And so the movement from the disordered to the ordered is what Christianity in time is, essentially, right? So it's what that means is that it's like St. Augustine will talk about how the virtues in our condition include within them essentially the warfare against the corresponding vice, right? That the virtue is a form of war, right? And that is only the case because of the fall. Had the fall not occurred, we could have enjoyed the virtues without reference to the corresponding vices. But that's not the case anymore. And so we have the cultivation of virtue itself is a form of warfare.
Right, which means there's a truth into saying that all politics is
a form of war. Right, because the end of politics is virtue, and is the movement from the imperfect to the perfect, which means that there is war in it. But the thing that in that war is always present, right? So like, it doesn't matter how holy you become in this life, there is areas of you of your personality that are not yet perfect, and are still wallowing in some degree of sin. And so there's a war being waged there. And this is something that happens individually with the Christian in his own spiritual life, but then is also social. It's a social reality.
Totally.
So one of the ways of thinking about this would be then if the church is the movement from the imperfect to the perfect, if that's what the church militant is, then imperfection or sin is a integral to the church. What I mean is, like, I know this is probably sounding like very dubious to people, but if they understand what I mean, I think they might not, is that part of being a true Christian is knowing that you're a sinner. Right. That and the Christian is the one who identifies that himself as the sinner.
Yeah.
So like what I mean is, so what that means is that his sin as a personal phenomenon, like I am a sinner, like my sin is an essential aspect of Christianity.
Yeah.
Okay. So Christianity, then you might say, in that way of thinking about it, is sort of in its nature corrupt, because like in its nature, it includes its negation. It includes virtue is the perfection, but the very existence of Christianity, like what it is in its essence, is the dynamic movement between vice and virtue, and so it includes within it a comprehension of its own undoing, or its own negation.
Yeah.
Right. Which is very unique among sort
Well,
of
yeah, I mean,
systems.
I compare it. Well, it doesn't seem very systematic. I mean,
No, it's not a system.
I compare it to the ideologies, right? Where I'm a liberalism or nationalism, socialism. Those are forms of life which presume that imperfection can be done away with.
That's right.
If we would just do X, Y, and Z, right? Whereas
Yeah.
Christianity does seem to be the only form that says not only will imperfection never be done away with, but what we are as Christians is a war on imperfection.
On imperfection,
that
right?
will never end. But and it's weirder than that, because it's not just saying like it's a war that will never end practically, as if there's some like practical point at which we could end, we just aren't strong enough or something like that. It's paradoxically saying that, well, this war has both already been won by Christ, and we will only ever enter into the fullness of that victory when all our efforts cease.
That's right, and it becomes grace pouring down from above, and we become sorted in the final. I mean, this is the plot line for Augustine's City of God, which is profoundly important to the way I think about things. But that this mingling of sin and virtue, this mingling of the good and the bad, is present within the church herself, as she moves towards becoming the church triumphant, which is the perfect city of God. So the city of God on earth is a city of God, a city at war.
Yeah.
Right. But it's at war, grasping in hope after that final victory that's already been won, that's assured to it.
Yeah.
Right. So it's battling towards the victory. That is hope, or so in hope, that victory that is true peace.
Right.
So as progress is made, though, peace is really extended. So it's not this sort of total depravity notion of we're always at war, so the war is always the same magnitude. No, that's not right. Like movement into peace is real.
Yeah.
Movement into the calming of the heart is a real thing. The assuaging of anxiety, and as that occurs, the war becomes more focused. I mean, it's like you're pushing the enemy back and you're winning, right? And that's the sort of strategic objective of the city of God. Now, the city of man, which is the tyrannical city, right, is also a mingling of order and disorder, because disorder can't exist other than a disordering of the order.
Right. There have to be goods within pagan city.
So what's weird about it is, when you think about it this way, it's like the city of man is always really an aspect of the city of God. Okay, and I know that sounds, because the city of man, like the example Augustine will give, is that a man who's hanging upside down by his feet is disordered. He's not supposed to be hanging upside down by his feet, right? That's a disordering of man. But the reason, and that disordering causes him pain, but the reason it causes him pain is that he's not actually disordered in his nature.
Right.
He's not supposed to be hanging upside down, and he is hanging upside down, so it hurts. Right. So he's still a part of the order, the cosmic, and he can't escape that.
Yeah.
Right. And so the point I'm getting at with the city of man as being sort of an aspect of the city of God is that the city of man is also a mixture of peace and war, of good and evil, vice and virtue. And so, but what's happening there is that it's instead of ascending towards peace or ascending towards a more perfect form, it's descending. So it's attempting to replace peace with war. It's attempting to replace virtue with vice, right? And so it's still the one humanity is, some are waging the war up and others are waging the war down.
Yeah, right.
Right. I mean, this is the sort of form that Augustine shows us,
Mhm.
and that it'll be not until the end of time that the final sorting occurs.
Yeah. So it
Right.
does seem like it's not the case that, I mean, nothing could be further from the case than that war is not a part of the Christian life, or that somehow the negation of war is what's meant by Christian politics, but rather, I mean, there's a few things that seem to happen in distinction to a tyranny, namely the enemy in a tyranny is useful, and so the object within tyranny is always to continuously produce the enemy.
Yeah. Yep.
And this is what I think is particularly nefarious about tyrannies, is that they don't actually want to win. Like, they want to hold out an enemy and say your peace depends on victory,
Right.
but they don't actually want the extension of that peace, because then all those mechanisms by which they gain from the war go away.
Right.
Whereas within the Christian society, when an enemy is pointed out, not only do you want to destroy the enemy in fact, but then you want to lose. You want all of those tactics that socially and individually you take on in order to defeat the enemy to be provisional.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. And
And
you don't really want
and
to,
that's how you
you only
mark
want to destroy
progress.
the enemy insofar as he's an enemy,
Right.
right? Like you want to destroy the enemy in him, not him.
Which is why and this has always puzzled me, right? That, St. Paul will say things like, well, we're not at war with flesh and blood, which seems a little silly given that Christians were being murdered.
Murdered.
But it's
Yeah.
sure looks like it, Paul. When he talks about we're at war with powers and principalities, and then when the kind of enemies are listed for the Christian, it's sin, the flesh, and the devil. I think one of the effects of turning our martial or our warlike aspect to ourselves and to definite enemies that are not just human beings that have that opportunity to become no
Right.
longer our enemies,
Right.
is that on the one hand, it's a way that we work towards our salvation, but on the other hand, it's a way that we prevent the lie of tyranny.
Mhm.
Because when the tyrant says, well, the enemy is now whoever, the Chinese, the unvaccinated, whatever.
Right, yeah.
A Christian is in the position to always know who the enemy is, that it's always sin, it's always the flesh, it's always the devil, and that the true war that never ends is one that's marked by constant progress in holiness. The false war that never ends is marked by constant regress in terms of peace. Like, you're just
That's right.
constantly losing more and more of a peaceful society because you're still at war.
Right.
And those seem to me to be two paths that are obvious, like two ways of fighting in the world, two ways of being aggressive in the world, of defending goods in the world, is to work towards a genuine extension of peace,
Right.
into more and more of your individual and then social life, or to be more and more scared, and so extend more and more war into peaceful existence.
Right. No, I think it's.
But you see, I'm saying that Christianity has a kind of a preventative effect on the world, that it's like, don't be fooled who the real enemy is. And that's why it seems to have penance and humility like built into it, because at any point where we're saying things like, this is this person, this nation is the cause of all of our woe and anxiety, like a Christian can't actually believe that. I mean,
No,
he's
in
taught
fact,
from the beginning that it's sin, original sin, and his own.
Christianity. I mean, the biblical take on all that is often very sort of disturbing in the insistence that your external enemy is a punishment for your sins.
Yeah, right.
And it's always sort of like, really, man, that's the way this works.
Yeah.
But I think one of the things that we've tried to do is see how that's a truth sociologically,
Yeah.
not merely in a sort of just mystical sense, but in a sociological sense, like your tyrannical, your sinfulness
Yeah.
exposes you to the enemy.
Yeah.
Like, your enemy becomes more efficacious against you because of your sin.
Yeah.
Right. I think that's true.
I think it's also why Christianity, when it's really lived, is so obnoxious to like socialist ideologies, or because it's not a fun person to be in a room with, because in an ideological world you have everyone pointing at an enemy and saying like, we're at war with X, and if we defeat X, all will be well. And the Christian is the one that's constantly saying like, I am responsible for our continued lack of peace.
Yeah, and who
There's
says,
nothing easy.
and who always says, well, maybe we could just convince him to be a nice guy or
Yeah,
something.
right. Yeah.
Like the enemy. No, I mean, really, this sounds like sometimes people. It's like you read Leo the 13th or something. You know, you brought up socialists, and that always brings me back to Rerum Novarum, and the socialists are positing these kinds of this sort of absolute class war.
Yeah.
And then Leo's response is something like, well, no, actually, like there's no reason why rich people and poor people can't just get along.
Be friends. Friendship between the
like
classes.
Have brotherly love.
Yeah.
And everyone's like, what, dude? Seriously, brotherly love? And it's like, no, seriously, actually, seriously.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like,
well, it's so. I mean, and I'm confessing this. So this is not. I'm confessing this as a impulse and a sin on my own part, that there is something so very liberating about not being responsible for the problem. There's something so very liberating about war, that all of life seems to be narrowed to a point where everything you want, everything good, is attainable through a singular destruction that's visible and material to you.
Yep.
Right. And I think it's especially liberating for people who are guilty Christians, right? Is that there's a rebellion of conscience that knows that there's no, that peace isn't possible except for yourself becoming a peaceful person. That kind of knows that, yeah, if we destroy that enemy, I'll need a new one, because this is what's getting me excited.
No, I know.
You see this in politics.
It's almost like a form of procrastination or self-delusion, isn't it? It can be pretty juvenile.
Oh, absolutely, especially when you posit your enemy is. I mean, you see this right when your enemy becomes like it's the global pedophile regime or whatever. Like, on the one hand, maybe you've got some evidence.
That might be.
Yeah, probably. It's definitely the most believable.
Yeah, of all the conspiracies. That's
but on the other hand, it's why does it excite people? Why is it like what's driving so much of politics? It's like, well, it's pretty sure that you can do nothing about that besides be made righteous in your opposition to it.
That's right. Yeah, no, I think that's correct. It's funny. It's weird how predictable these things are. When you study history and you study, say, the Nazis with the Jews, and you read about the kind of language they used. Oh, the Jews, it's necessary that they're the sort of universal enemy. They're the internal contagion. They start using language of disease. They start using that kind of language. They're responsible for all of our suffering.
Yeah.
Right. They're responsible for all this. And that's always used as a sort of textbook example of this kind of mechanism.
Right.
But then you see it so clearly. I mean, we see it just in our day and age right now, right? Where so much so that the language of contagion, of uncleanness, of dirtiness is being deployed again. Yeah. And this group is responsible for all of our suffering. Right. Even though
really?
Even though, in fact, the suffering, most of the suffering is inflicted by the one who's telling us that this group over here is responsible for all of our suffering.
Right, absolutely.
Right, so it has this like weird abusive element to it. This kind of like weird, why are you making me hurt you? Type of a thing. Do you know what I mean?
So much.
Yeah, I love you so much. Why are you making me hurt you? It's like that kind of a thing. But how susceptible people are to it. Well, like they want to believe that they can point at the enemy and say it's those people's fault that I feel this way.
Oh, it's so I think it's because once you have established an enemy like that, you're free from Christianity.
Right.
And I think that's what people really want. Right? They want to be absolved from. I mean, we are obviously as a society, a heretical and increasingly pagan society, overdue for penance, for I read somewhere the only mass production that's going to save us is the mass production of hair shirts.
No, because the Christian war, like we've been saying a couple times now, but it bears repeating, the Christian war is first and foremost a spiritual war that each one of us wages.
Right.
And that out of that war, we're capable of waging the external war, right? And what we're waging the war against externally is the imperfection or the sin in our brother. So it really is an extension of the same war.
Yeah.
Right, the spiritual war internally to.
Right, I must fight my selfishness, and then
I must fight your selfishness.
Yeah.
Right,
but always included in any attack on the enemy.
But the sin that the other has is always in you too.
Yeah, exactly.
Right, like so.
And in fact, to the degree that you can recognize it in you, is the degree to
which you can wage it justly against them.
Exactly.
That's right. Yeah. So.
Yeah. Well, and I think, but don't you think that it's like this is where the enmity production of modernity is actually getting its fuel? It's like you said it maybe a little cynically in the sense of like, well, why are we so easily fooled
Right.
Like, isn't it just completely on the face of it ridiculous that this group of people is responsible for all of our problems? Like, isn't
Yeah.
fanaticism
Yeah.
ridiculous?
That's what we. Yeah.
Well, it's like, well, okay, but what if the human person is a warring person? Like, what if Christianity is true?
Right.
And the historical narrative is one against sin, which is total. Like, there, you are always at war with sin.
Mhm.
There is a place in which you can say all of our anxiety comes from here. But what has historically been pointed to, well, really since Christianity was victorious in Europe, what historically has been pointed to is always includes, again, sin, flesh, the devil. It's always including the whole society. So it's
Mhm.
always, yes, there is one thing responsible. It's sin, and it's my sin, and it's your sin, and it's our sin, and it's we can fight it, right? So what I'm saying is, it seems like tyranny is riding on a kind of inheritance by which we do blame one thing,
Right. No, I see.
and that's
Yeah.
our distance from God.
Yeah.
That's our disobedience and our decision, and then our social structures that just
Yeah.
cement that disobedience. And it was Christianity that revealed that to the world. Like, oh, this is why you're so scared. This is why you're enslaved in military regimes. This is
Right.
why you're worshiping men. It's because you have been convinced that the battle, right, is this world, that it's material, that
Right.
it's earthly, but it's not. And so what St. Paul is saying when he says, hey, it's not flesh and blood, it's powers and principalities, is liberating,
Mhm.
which means that it's not flesh and blood. Therefore, a tyrant can't just point out this flesh and blood over here and get you motivated again, doing another big,
Yeah.
war machine that's going to build your whole economy and society, and then you're going to have to replace it. No, it's with powers, principalities. It's with yourself. And the church is militant in the sense that it is the thing fighting
Mhm.
this one cause of our problems, which means that every tyranny has to be a pseudo church, because
That's what
it
they
has
are.
to
Yeah.
say,
That's right. That's what.
has to say, we found the one
Mhm.
cause, we found the original sin, we have the redemption, but they make it earthly, they say, and it's this guy, right?
Yeah, no, that
It's
maybe
Jim.
gets back. That helps maybe put some flesh on what I said
Okay.
when I was trying to say that the city of man is sort of a part of the city of God.
Yeah,
And I
it
know
has to
that's
use it.
because the city of man is human. It's made up of
Yeah,
humans,
yeah,
right? And the city of God is humanity being perfected. And so the use of war is heretical, right? Like it's like
Mhm.
because it's not. And this is an important idea. Like, why is it that tyrannies everywhere adopt this? And it's because of what you just said. Well, because man is at war,
Yeah.
right? Like that's who we that's who we are, and we all
Yes.
know it.
Yes.
So it's like we feel it. We're at war. So are we at war against the true enemy or a false enemy? That seems to be the distinction.
Exactly. And the
Right.
church is the one that in her mercy unveils the true enemy constantly.
Right.
And I think that's what we don't want. And so when we talk about liberalism as a tyranny, I think we have to remember that the genius of liberalism is to take that war and arguably, theoretically, have it as every man, against every other man. But historically, it's a war against the church.
That's right. That's
So what I mean is,
exactly
like,
right.
every every word to the contrary of tyranny, every word that says, it's not an earthly salvation, it's not an earthly problem, it is, but it's never just an earthly problem, itself becomes the earthly enemy. I mean, that's the genius. It's like it pulls the church down to earth and then says, well, now our rebellion is against, really any tradition,
But against these people who are telling you it's not earthly.
right. Yeah, exactly.
That's just a tactic of their earthly domination.
Exactly. Yeah. The priests are telling it because they want money or something.
Yeah, exactly. No,
Yeah.
I know. Yeah, the war against the church and the extension of the real war into what was peaceful is, yeah, that's the tactic. So like the morality is the oppressor.
Right.
So destroy it.
Yeah.
We're at war with morals.
Yeah.
For example.
When people say that, though.
I know. Yeah.
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 Yeah, and then war becomes the lifeblood of the society. It becomes the lifeblood of the economy. It becomes a justifying reason for acting one way versus another. And it just seems to me that, when I read the Old Testament and I guess it's how do I put it? The nations being at war seems strange, seemed a lot stranger than it does now. It just seems like this is the alternative to a universal church.
Hmm.
This is the alternative to a reforming of humanity that wars only against imperfection where it sees it, because it has a genuine hope in moving towards perfection. Right.
Right. No, I think so. And I think this universality of war, then, of some form of war, is also what allows for the feasibility of the trickery, right? That
Sure.
the tyrant can perform,
Mhm.
right? Because we're already all sort of oriented towards some sort of conflict, and so that they can always use that, right? They
Yeah.
can always
Yeah.
twist it and get good people to do bad things
Yeah.
through the lie. That's why the lie works, right? Because
Mhm.
it has a grounding in reality.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that's tyranny for you, the extension of war into peace. And then that's the church for you, right? The extension of peace
Peace
into
into
war.
war.
Yeah.
Right.
And so it seems, I mean, sometimes we often try to end with some advice for like what to do, but like there's a reason for the assertion of holiness as being a solution to tyranny that isn't just a kind of a cop out, right? Because obviously holiness is always the answer. Sanctity of persons and their society and their social orders is always, you can
But the cop out, it often is a cop out. People say, "Oh, just
become holy.
conversion is the
Yeah.
solution." But what we've tried to argue, I think, is that slavery to vice is always at the same time slavery to other men,
Yeah.
and slavery to other men is always accompanied by slavery to vice, at least sustained slavery to other men.
Mhm.
And the alternative is also the case, that virtue is freedom, and that freedom and political freedom,
Yeah.
like virtue leads to political freedom, and political freedom is only sustainable within virtue, right?
Yeah.
And so when we talk about conversion as being the solution, the spiritual warfare as being the solution, we're not saying that as if the political doesn't matter. It's understanding that human beings are spiritual creatures,
Mhm.
and we're both political creatures and spiritual creatures. So these things are bound up together at an anthropological level, right? At a level of social analysis,
Yeah.
we can see that they're bound together,
Right. Right.
right? It's not just some sort of fideistic thing or some
Yeah.
sort of like extrinsic connection. Like
Yeah.
it's a connection that happens in our very natures.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. The resistance to tyranny only happens by becoming socially a kind of people that have the gumption to resist.
Yes.
And that is what we historically have called the virtues, and which are impossible to attain without grace. And so conversion is not icing on the cake. It's not something that would be nice. It's necessary.
It's not something that's private. It's not something that's
Right.
hidden away. It's not.
And it's not something unrelated to it's not something accidentally related to resistance to tyranny. I mean, the church is established in order to enable people to resist tyranny. And yes, it has a much broader understanding than the kind of people that you're probably mad at right now, right?
Right. Yeah.
Because the tyrant is the devil, and the tyrant is sin, and the tyrant is flesh, and it's your own failings.
Right.
But it is also that guy you're probably really mad at. Right?
Yeah, exactly.
And the guy you're really mad at, who's a tyrant, only operates with any kind of effectiveness because of all those other things, right?
Mhm.
He can only convince through propaganda insofar as people are eating it, and he can only convince through fear insofar as we really are not courageous. He can only convince, like we have to become degraded in order for tyranny to work. This is what we've said again and again.
Right.
So when we talk about the church as the reform of humanity itself, we are talking about an institution divinely instituted to make humanity resistant to tyrants. I mean, that's a negative way of phrasing it. Obviously, you would want to say, and that's not a negative state. That's actual freedom, which is ultimately for love for Christ, that moves us to heaven, and not just to sort of this world Christian utopia or something.
Right.
But it has to move through actual reform of this world.
Indeed.
So it just seems like, in the end, if people ask, and they probably won't, what's the solution to tyranny? It is holiness. But it has to be understood because the pursuit of holiness alone encompasses the destruction of all tyranny.
Yeah. No, I think that's right. I think that another takeaway would be, I mean, that's the most obvious and the most important, what you just said, but would be to see tyranny, to notice it, to
Yep.
acknowledge it. For us, like as you move through your life and you see power, and to recognize that power is real. And what we mean is that, like, powerful people really have influence over less powerful people, really affect them from the top down.
Yeah.
Like, this is a real phenomenon. Like, powerful people affect weaker people, either for their good or for their detriment.
Yeah.
And to see that and know that, and not let and first of all, see it when you have power and make sure you're using it properly.
Right.
But also, don't let people off the hook. Hold them to account.
Right.
See it, right? Know it's happening. Right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And maybe this is just part of what seems to me like a real movement of the Holy Spirit within Catholics these days. Is just this sense that our faith is for the sake of the world in some way. It is the salvation of the world, right? But that means it's the salvation of all of our institutions, of our social orders, of our politics, of our economics. That when we become holy, when we sanctify the social order, we're actually efficacious in the creation of peaceful peoples and resistance to tyranny, which is just its opposite. And so that use of power for the sake of the common good, both in others and in yourself, is not, well, it's two things. Number one is that it is rock bottom, the essential way to actually produce the kind of society that we want. And number two, it's something that you're always responsible for. You're never off the hook, as you said.
Right.
Okay, well, we better wrap it up. We're gonna do one more. It's not gonna be an episode. We're gonna do a Q&A. I want to say January 18th. Sounds totally correct. I really hope it is.
Okay.
But we're going to do a Q&A where if you guys could take some time to just maybe go through any episodes that you didn't hit, and form any questions you'd like or that come up through this. Because I mean, to me, it does seems like difficult. I don't know if you felt that it's difficult. Maybe it's a breeze for you.
This whole thing?
Yeah,
it's very difficult. Yeah.
So
I get lost all the time.
So far be it from us to presume that you're just like following with what's already difficult for us to say. So yeah, any questions, we'll try and take them into a Q&A session like we did with the Good Money podcast. And then furthermore, we have our event, Is America Tyranny, coming up this summer.
June 3rd.
Yeah, June of next year. And so please, if you're interested,
go to the website,
sign
check it
up
out.
for that.
Yeah.
All right, and until next time.
Thanks.
Bye.